Now that Thomas is gone, you need to pack your things and leave by the end of the week, my daughter-in-law said, her voice calm, almost polite, as if she were asking me to return a borrowed dish instead of abandoning the home I had lived in for 32 years, and my son, my own son, sat there at the dining table, staring down at his plate, saying nothing, not even looking at me. And in that silence, I felt something inside me shift, not break, not shatter, just quietly move into a place I didn't recognize, a place where the rules I had lived by no longer applied. Because a week ago I had stood beside a polished wooden casket and said goodbye to my husband, the man who built this house with me, who painted these walls with his own hands, who used to sit at the head of this very table every Sunday morning with a cup of black coffee and the newspaper folded just so. And now his chair was empty, still slightly pulled back as if he might return at any moment. And yet here I was being told I no longer belonged in the life we created together. I looked at Vanessa then, really looked at her, at the way she folded her hands neatly in front of her, composed, rehearsed, and I realized this wasn't sudden. This wasn't grief talking. This was something planned, something decided long before the funeral flowers had wilted. And when I turned to Ryan, waiting, hoping, for even the smallest flicker of hesitation, he finally spoke, his voice low, almost tired. Mom, it's just the house is too much for you now, and we've been thinking, he said, as if I were no longer part of that word, as if I had already been moved outside the circle of family without anyone bothering to tell me. I nodded slowly, because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't allowed myself to see before, that the distance between us hadn't started tonight. It had been growing quietly, piece by piece, in missed calls, shortened visits, holidays rearranged around someone else's preferences, until now, when it had finally taken shape as a decision spoken out loud at the dinner table. I placed my fork down carefully beside my plate, the soft clink sounding louder than it should have in the stillness, and I said nothing, not because I agreed, not because I didn't feel the sting of it, but because I knew that whatever I said in that moment would only make me smaller in their eyes, and I refused to give them that. So I stood up, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my blouse, the same one Thomas had once said brought out the color in my eyes, and I walked out of the dining room without another word, past the hallway where our family photos lined the walls, past the living room where his favorite armchair still faced the window, and up the staircase that creaked in the exact same places it always had. And when I closed the bedroom door behind me, I allowed myself one long, steady breath, not a sob, not a collapse, just a breath, because they thought my silence meant surrender. But what they didn't understand, what they had never needed to understand, was that silence can also mean something else entirely. I did not sleep that night, not because of what Vanessa said, but because of how easily it had been said, as if my entire life could be folded into a suitcase and carried out through the front door without leaving a trace. And sometime around 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, staring at the back door where Thomas used to step out every morning to check the weather before deciding whether he would water the garden or wait for the afternoon sun. And for a moment, I could almost hear the faint creak of that door opening, the soft shuffle of his slippers, the quiet rhythm of a life that had once been steady and predictable. But when I blinked, there was only silence, thick and unfamiliar, pressing in from every corner of the house. And it was then I realized something that settled deeper than grief, something colder, that the house no longer felt like it was holding me. It felt like it was waiting for me to leave, as if the walls themselves had already accepted the version of the future that Vanessa had spoken into existence at the dinner table. And by the time the first light of morning slipped through the blinds, I had already made my decision, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. I would leave, not because they told me to, but because I needed to see what they would do when they believed they had won. I moved slowly through the house, taking in every detail with a kind of quiet precision. The hallway where Ryan had taken his first steps, the small dent in the wall near the staircase that Thomas had promised to fix every year and never did. The kitchen counter where I had stood for decades preparing meals that gathered everyone together, and I noticed how different everything felt now, not physically, but emotionally, like a stage after the audience has gone home. The set still intact but the meaning gone, and when I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway, my hand resting lightly against the frame, Because this room was the last place Thomas had been, the last place his presence had filled the air in a way that made everything feel safe. His side of the bed was still slightly indented, his watch still resting on the nightstand beside a stack of papers he had been reviewing the week before he passed, and I sat down carefully on the edge of the mattress, letting my fingers trace the fabric where his hand had once rested, and I allowed myself exactly 1 minute, 60 seconds of memory of what it had meant to be loved and protected in a way that never required explanation. And then I stood up, because I could not afford to stay in that moment any longer. I opened the closet and pulled out a single suitcase, the same one we had used years ago on a trip to Vermont, and I began to pack with deliberate calm. Not everything, not the entire life that had been built here, just what I needed: clothes, a few personal items, and one small wooden box that Thomas had given me on our 30th anniversary. And as I moved through the motions, I could hear voices downstairs, low and indistinct. Ryan and Vanessa talking in that careful tone people use when they think someone else might be listening. And I paused for a moment, not to eavesdrop, but to acknowledge that whatever they were planning, whatever assumptions they had made about me, were already in motion, and that realization did not frighten me the way it might have before. Instead, it settled into me with a kind of quiet steadiness, because I understood something they did not, that Thomas had never been careless, not with our life, not with our future, and certainly not with me. And when I finally zipped the suitcase closed, the sound was soft but final. I took one last look around the room, not as someone being forced out, but as someone choosing to step away from a situation that had not yet revealed its full truth. And when I walked back downstairs, carrying my suitcase by my side, Vanessa looked up with a small, satisfied smile that she did not bother to hide, while Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I met their eyes with the same calm expression I had worn the night before, because they thought this was the end of something, the moment where I disappeared quietly from their lives. But all I could think, as I reached for the front door handle, was how little they understood about what Thomas had left behind, and how patient I had learned to be. I did not go far, just a small extended stay hotel about 15 minutes from the house, the kind of place people use for business trips or short transitions, with neutral colored walls and furniture that felt deliberately forgettable. And as I set my suitcase down on the narrow bed, I noticed how quiet it was, not the heavy silence of loss, but a lighter, almost hollow kind of quiet that came from being somewhere that held none of my memories, none of my history. And for the first time since Thomas passed, I allowed myself to sit without feeling like the space around me was watching, judging, or waiting for me to leave. I folded my hands in my lap and looked out the window at the parking lot below, where cars came and went without meaning, and I thought about how easily my life had been reduced to this single room, how quickly decades could be compressed into one suitcase and a carry-on. But even as that thought settled, something else began to rise alongside it, something steadier, something clearer, because distance has a way of sharpening the truth, and away from the house, away from Vanessa's controlled tone and Ryan's silence, I could finally see the pattern that had been forming long before that night at the table. I thought back to the small things I had dismissed over the past few years, the times Ryan had canceled Sunday dinners at the last minute, saying they were too busy, the holidays that had quietly shifted to Vanessa's family without much discussion, the way decisions about the house had started happening without including me, even when I was still living there. And now, sitting in that unfamiliar room, each of those moments lined up with a kind of uncomfortable precision, not random, not accidental, but deliberate, as if I had been slowly moved out of my own life piece by piece until the final step felt almost natural to them. And I wondered, not with anger, but with a kind of distant curiosity, how long Vanessa had been planning this, how many conversations had happened behind closed doors, how many times Ryan had chosen silence instead of speaking up. And that was when I reached for my phone, not to call him, not yet, but to scroll through messages, emails, small digital traces of a relationship that now felt unfamiliar. And I noticed how the tone had changed over time, how warmth had been replaced with brevity, how questions had turned into statements, and it confirmed what I was beginning to understand, that this was not about concern for my well-being or the size of the house. It was about control, about ownership, about positioning themselves as the rightful center of a life that I had helped build. I set the phone down slowly and leaned back against the headboard, closing my eyes for a moment. And in that stillness, I could hear Thomas's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me, not in words, but in the memory of his certainty, the way he handled things, the way he never left important matters to chance. And a memory surfaced then, uninvited but sharp, of an afternoon about 6 months before he passed, when he had been sitting at his desk in the study, reviewing documents with that same focused expression he always wore when something mattered. And I had asked him, half joking, if he was planning something complicated, and he had looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Just making sure everything is exactly the way it should be." And at the time, I had not thought much of it, because Thomas had always been organized, always careful. But now, in that quiet hotel room, those words felt different, heavier, like a piece of a puzzle I had not realized I was holding. I opened my eyes and sat up straighter, the shift so subtle it might not have been visible to anyone else. But I felt it clearly, that quiet movement inside me from reaction to intention, and without rushing, without urgency. I reached for my bag and pulled out the small wooden box I had packed that morning, placing it gently on the bed in front of me, my fingers resting on the lid for a moment before opening it, because I understood now that whatever came next would not be decided by what Vanessa said at a dinner table or what Ryan failed to say in response. It would be decided by what Thomas had already said in place. And for the first time since I walked out of that house, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath of certainty. Not because I knew all the answers yet, but because I knew something they did not. That this story had not ended when I closed that front door. It had only just begun to reveal itself. I lifted the lid of the wooden box slowly, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I understood that whatever was inside had been placed there with intention, and Thomas had never been a man who did anything without intention. Inside there were only a few items, nothing that would seem important to anyone else. A neatly folded envelope with my name written in his familiar handwriting, a small set of keys, and a document folded with careful precision. And for a moment I simply looked at them, letting the weight of their presence settle in, because I realized that this box had not been packed in haste. It had been prepared, quietly, deliberately, long before illness or loss had entered our lives. I picked up the envelope first, tracing my fingers over the ink of my name, Evelyn, the way he always wrote it, steady and certain, and when I opened it, the paper inside carried that same quiet confidence, the kind that did not need to explain itself. His words were simple, direct, exactly as he had always spoken to me. He wrote that if I was reading this, it meant things had not unfolded the way he had hoped, but he trusted me to understand what to do next. He reminded me, in that understated way of his, that everything we had built together was meant to protect me, not burden me, and that no one, no matter who they were, had the right to make me feel like a guest in my own life. I paused there, my eyes lingering on that line, because it echoed something I had been trying to name since that night at the table, that quiet displacement, that subtle shift from belonging to inconvenience. And suddenly it had a clarity I could not ignore. I set the letter down gently and reached for the folded document, unfolding it carefully to reveal what I recognized immediately as legal paperwork, the kind Thomas had been reviewing that afternoon months ago. The language was precise, formal, but even at a glance I could see enough to understand the structure of it. The house, the accounts, the protections, everything had been arranged in a way that centered me, not as an afterthought, not as a temporary occupant, but as the primary holder of rights. There were conditions, specific and unmistakable, tied to how I was to be treated, clauses that ensured my position could not be quietly erased or pushed aside. And as I read, the steady calm that had been building inside me settled into something stronger, something grounded, because this was not about reclaiming something lost. It was about recognizing something that had never actually been taken from me in the first place. I leaned back slightly, letting the document rest in my lap, and for the first time since I had walked out of that house, I allowed myself to see the situation without the weight of emotion distorting it. Vanessa had spoken with certainty, with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Ryan had followed that certainty, not out of cruelty perhaps, but out of habit, out of convenience, and together they had created a version of reality where I no longer had a place. But that version had been built on assumptions, not facts, and now, sitting in that quiet hotel room with Thomas's careful preparations laid out in front of me, I could see the difference clearly. I folded the document back along its original lines, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the order in which it had been created, and I placed it back in the box alongside the keys, because I understood that this was not something to rush into, not something to confront in anger or urgency. This required patience, the same kind of patience Thomas had always valued, the kind that allowed truth to reveal itself fully before acting on it. I stood up then and walked over to the window again, looking out at the same parking lot, the same passing cars, but everything felt different now, not because the world had changed, but because my understanding of it had shifted. I was no longer standing on uncertain ground, no longer reacting to what had been said or done. I was standing on something solid, something that had been prepared long before any of this had happened. And as I rested my hand lightly against the glass, I found myself thinking not about what I had lost, but about what they had misunderstood, and how that misunderstanding would soon have consequences they had not even considered, not because I intended to punish them, but because truth has a way of doing that on its own. And for the first time since the night everything changed, I allowed a small, quiet certainty to settle into place, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like the kind of confidence that does not need to be announced to be real. The next morning, I did not rush. I did not make any calls right away. Instead, I followed the same quiet routine I had practiced for years. I made coffee using the small machine on the counter, measured the grounds carefully, waited for the slow drip to fill the cup, and sat by the window as the steam rose in thin, steady lines, because I understood that what came next required a clear mind, not a reactive one. And as I took the first sip, I began to think not about what Vanessa had said or what Ryan had failed to say, but about what needed to be done, not emotionally, but practically, step by step. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I had not needed to use in a very long time. Daniel Whitmore, Thomas's attorney, the man who had handled every major decision we had made over the past 2 decades, from the purchase of the house to the restructuring of our accounts when Thomas retired. And for a moment, I held my thumb just above the screen, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this call was not about asking for help. It was about confirming what I already knew. I pressed the number and listened as the line rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, steady and familiar. Whitmore and Associates, and I introduced myself simply. This is Evelyn Carter. And there was a brief pause, followed by a shift in his tone, something more attentive, more aware, as if he had been expecting this call at some point, even if he did not know exactly when. Mrs. Carter, he said, I am very sorry for your loss. And I thanked him, because courtesy matters, even in moments like this. And then I said, I found something Thomas left for me. And that was all it took. There was no need to explain further, no need to describe the contents of the box, because the silence on the other end told me he understood exactly what I meant. Would you be available to come in today? He asked, not as a suggestion, but as a natural next step, and I agreed, setting a time for late morning. And when the call ended, I felt no rush of emotion, no sense of urgency, just a quiet alignment between what I had discovered and what needed to happen next. I dressed with the same care I would have used for any important appointment, choosing a simple navy blouse and a light gray jacket. Nothing dramatic, nothing that called attention, because this was not about appearance, it was about presence. And as I gathered my things, placing the wooden box carefully into my bag, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and for a moment I studied the reflection, not searching for signs of the woman who had been asked to leave her home, but for the one who understood that she had never truly lost her place in it. And when I left the hotel room, closing the door behind me with a soft click, I carried that understanding with me, not as a shield, but as a foundation. The drive to Daniel's office was familiar, the same route Thomas and I had taken countless times over the years, past the small diner on the corner, past the park where families gathered on weekends, past the office buildings that all seemed to blend together after a while. And as I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, I sat for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge the transition, because this was the point where assumption would meet reality, where what Vanessa believed would begin to separate from what was actually true. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building with measured steps, the glass doors reflecting a version of me that felt both familiar and newly defined. and when I entered, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and directed me to a conference room, where I took a seat at the long table, placing my bag gently in front of me, and waited, not nervously, not impatiently, but with the same quiet composure that had carried me through the past few days, because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before. That patience is not passive, it is deliberate, it is a form of control. And as the door opened and Daniel Whitmore stepped inside, his expression professional but attentive, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by emotion or assumption, but by something far more solid, something Thomas had ensured long before any of us had realized it would be needed. Daniel did not sit down immediately. Instead, he closed the door behind him with a quiet click and took a moment to look at me, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with a kind of measured acknowledgement, as if he had already anticipated this meeting long before I had made the call. And when he finally took his seat across from me, he folded his hands on the table and said, "I assume you found what Thomas prepared." And I nodded once, reaching into my bag and placing the wooden box gently on the polished surface between us. And there was something about the way he looked at it, not curious, not cautious, but respectful, that confirmed what I had begun to understand on my own, that this was never meant to be discovered by accident. It was meant to be used when necessary, and only when necessary. He opened the box with careful precision, removing the document first, scanning the pages with the familiarity of someone who had seen them before, and as his eyes moved across the lines, there was no shift in his expression, no sign of concern, only a quiet certainty that seemed to settle deeper with each passing second. And when he finished, he placed the document back down and looked at me directly. "Thomas was very thorough," he said, his voice steady. He wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity, and I listened without interrupting, because I knew this was not the moment for questions. This was the moment for understanding. He continued, explaining that the house was not simply passed down in the way most people assume. It had been placed into a trust structure, one that granted me full and exclusive rights to live in it for the rest of my life, without interference, without conditions tied to anyone else's preferences, and more than that, there were protective clauses, specific language that addressed scenarios where pressure, coercion, or exclusion might be used against me. And in those cases, any attempt to remove me or diminish my position would trigger consequences that extended beyond the house itself, affecting access to other assets, distributions, and future claims. And as he spoke, I felt no shock, no sudden rush of emotion, only a gradual alignment between what I had read the night before and what he was now confirming in clear, structured terms. He explained further that Ryan's assumption of ownership, if that was indeed what he believed, did not reflect the actual legal arrangement, and that any actions taken under that assumption could complicate matters for him in ways he likely had not considered. And I found myself thinking, not with anger, but with a kind of distant clarity, about how easily people can mistake proximity for authority, how simply being present in a house does not make it yours, how speaking with confidence does not change the underlying reality. And when Daniel paused, giving me space to respond, I did not ask what I should do. I did not ask what options were available, because the answer had already begun to take shape on its own. Instead, I asked a different question, a quieter one. Was he expecting this? And Daniel held my gaze for a moment before answering, not immediately, but carefully. He was preparing for possibilities, he said, and he believed you would know how to handle them. And there was something in that response that settled deeper than any legal explanation could, because it was not about documents or clauses or protections. It was about trust, not the legal kind, but the kind built over decades, the kind that does not need to be explained because it has already been proven. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a recognition of what had been placed in my hands. And when I reached for the document again, folding it with the same care I had used before, I understood that this was not about reclaiming something from Ryan or correcting Vanessa. It was about restoring balance, about allowing the truth to surface in a way that did not require confrontation or force, only clarity. And as I placed the papers back into the box and closed the lid, the soft sound seemed to mark a shift, not in the situation itself, but in my role within it, because I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was preparing to respond in a way that reflected what had already been set in place, and as I stood to leave, Daniel rose with me, offering a slight nod that carried more understanding than words could have. And when I stepped out of the office and into the daylight, the air felt different, not because anything outside had changed, but because I was no longer standing in uncertainty. I was standing in something far more solid, something that did not need to be defended or argued, only acknowledged. And as I walked toward my car, I found myself thinking, not about what I had lost, but about the moment when assumption meets reality, and how quietly, how inevitably, that moment was approaching. The meeting was scheduled for 3 days later, and in those 3 days, I did nothing to interrupt what Ryan and Vanessa believed was already settled. I did not call, I did not argue, I did not try to return to the house, because I understood now that their confidence depended on my silence, and the more complete that silence appeared, the more certain they would become, and certainty, when it is built on the wrong foundation, has a way of collapsing at exactly the right moment. The morning of the meeting, I dressed with the same quiet care I had practiced my entire life, choosing simplicity over statement, because this was not about making an impression, it was about being present in a way that did not need explanation. I arrived at the office 10 minutes early, the same building where I had met Daniel just days before, and as I stepped inside, I noticed Ryan and Vanessa already seated in the waiting area, their posture relaxed, their expressions composed, as if they were attending something routine, something predictable. Vanessa glanced up first, her eyes flicking over me briefly before returning to her phone, a small, almost dismissive movement that said more than any words could, while Ryan shifted slightly in his seat, offering a nod that felt more like acknowledgement than greeting. And in that moment, I saw them clearly, not as the people I had known for years, but as they were now, aligned in their assumptions, comfortable in what they believed to be their position. And I took a seat across from them without speaking, placing my bag neatly at my side, because there was nothing to say yet, not until the right moment arrived. When Daniel stepped out and called us in, we moved into the conference room together, the same long table, the same controlled environment, but this time the atmosphere carried a different weight, one that had not yet been recognized by everyone present. Vanessa chose her seat quickly, positioning herself closest to Daniel, as if proximity might reinforce authority, while Ryan sat beside her, his hands resting on the table in a way that suggested both anticipation and restraint. And I took my place across from them, not opposing, not retreating, simply present. And when Daniel began, his tone was measured, professional, free of any unnecessary emphasis. He outlined the purpose of the meeting, the structure of the estate, the process that would be followed, and as he spoke, I noticed how Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpened, as if waiting for a confirmation she had already decided was coming, and Ryan listened with that same quiet focus he had shown at the dinner table. But there was something different now, something less certain beneath the surface, and when Daniel reached the point where assumptions would meet definition, there was a subtle pause, not long, not dramatic, just enough to shift the air in the room. The primary residence, he said, his voice steady, has been placed under a trust arrangement, and I watched as Vanessa's expression remained composed, but her posture tightened just slightly, as if adjusting to a detail she had not expected to hear presented in that way. Daniel continued, explaining the structure, the rights, the conditions, each word placed carefully, each sentence building on the last, and as the meaning became clearer, I saw the first real change, not in what was being said, but in how it was being received. Vanessa's confidence did not disappear, but it began to hesitate, to search for confirmation that was no longer aligning with the information being presented, while Ryan's gaze shifted, moving between Daniel and the document in front of him, as if trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had believed. And I remained still, my hands resting lightly on the table, because this was not the moment for reaction. This was the moment for truth to unfold on its own, without interruption, without reinforcement. And as Daniel moved into the specific clauses, the protections, the conditions tied to my position, the room grew quieter, not in volume, but in certainty. And for the first time since I had walked out of that house, I saw something begin to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to recognize the shift from assumption to realization. And I understood then that the outcome had never depended on what was said at a dinner table. It depended on what had already been written, already decided, long before any of us had taken our seats in this room. And as I looked at Ryan, at the way his expression had begun to lose its earlier confidence, I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel vindication. I felt something quieter, something steadier, the simple recognition that truth does not need to be raised. It only needs to be revealed. And once it is, everything else begins to fall into place. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because every word he spoke carried its own weight. Mrs. Carter holds full lifetime residency rights to the property, he said, his tone even, almost understated, but the meaning of it settled into the room with unmistakable clarity, and I saw it then, the exact moment when Vanessa's confidence fractured, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in the smallest of ways, a tightening around her eyes, a pause in the way her fingers rested on the table, as if she were recalibrating her understanding in real time. Ryan leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he looked down at the document in front of him, scanning lines that no longer supported what he had assumed. And Daniel continued, not rushing, not emphasizing, simply laying out what had already been decided long before any of us sat in that room. He explained that the trust structure did not grant immediate ownership to Ryan, that control of the house, its use, and its decisions remained with me entirely, and that any attempt to remove me, pressure me to leave, or alter my position without my consent would not only be invalid, but would activate specific clauses that could affect distribution of other assets within the estate. And as those words settled, the room shifted again, this time more noticeably. Vanessa straightened in her chair, her composure still present, but now accompanied by something sharper, something more alert, as if she were searching for a way to reinterpret what she was hearing. There must be some misunderstanding, she said finally, her voice controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there before, and Daniel turned his attention to her with the same calm professionalism. There is no misunderstanding, he replied, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply precise. The language is very clear, and I watched as that clarity removed the last layer of assumption they had been holding on to. Ryan looked up then, his gaze shifting toward me for the first time since the meeting began. And there was something in his expression I had not seen in days, not confidence, not indifference, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a belief is no longer supported by reality. And I met his gaze without speaking, not to challenge him, not to accuse, but to allow him to see, to recognize the distance between what he had accepted and what was actually true. Daniel continued, outlining additional details, the protections embedded within the trust, the conditions that ensured my position could not be quietly bypassed. And with each sentence, the space Vanessa had occupied with such certainty grew smaller, more defined, no longer expansive, no longer assumed. And for a brief moment, silence settled over the table, not the kind that comes from hesitation, but the kind that follows clarity, when there is nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to adjust, only the presence of what is. And in that silence, Vanessa leaned back slightly, her posture no longer leaning forward, no longer claiming proximity as authority, while Ryan lowered his gaze again, his hands now resting still, as if movement itself might draw attention to what had just shifted. And I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly on the table, because this was not a moment that required reaction. It required presence, the kind that does not fill the space, but allows it to settle naturally. And as Daniel closed the folder in front of him, signaling the completion of his explanation, the outcome of the meeting was no longer something to be decided. It had already been established, not in this room, not in this moment, but long before, and I understood then that what Vanessa had said at the dinner table, what Ryan had accepted without question, had never altered that reality. It had only revealed their understanding of it. And as I looked at them both, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet steadiness, I realized that this was not about proving anything. It was about allowing what had always been true to be seen, fully, without interruption, and once seen, it did not need to be argued. It simply existed, unchanged, undeniable, and in that quiet, settled clarity, everything else began to fall away. No one spoke immediately after Daniel closed the folder, and that silence felt different from the ones before, not heavy, not uncertain, but settled, like something had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be forced. I looked at Ryan then, really looked at him, at the way his shoulders had shifted inward slightly, at the way his eyes avoided mine for a moment before finally meeting them, and in that brief exchange, I saw not the little boy who used to run down the hallway calling my name, but a man who had made a choice, a quiet one, an easy one, to stand beside someone else's certainty instead of questioning it. And I understood that this moment was not about correcting him or teaching him a lesson. It was simply about letting him see where that choice had led. Vanessa broke the silence first, her voice composed but tighter now. "So what happens next?" she asked, and there was something in the way she said it. Not demanding, not quite defensive, but searching, as if she were still trying to find a version of the situation that aligned with what she had expected. Daniel answered in the same measured tone he had used throughout, outlining the next steps, the formal recognition of the trust, the documentation, the fact that nothing needed to be changed because everything was already in place. And as he spoke, I listened without interruption, because I already knew what mattered, not the process, not the paperwork, but the understanding that had now settled between all of us. When he finished, the room fell quiet again, and this time, I allowed myself to move, just slightly. I reached for my bag, not hurried, not abrupt, simply deliberate, and I stood, my chair making a soft sound against the floor, drawing their attention without demanding it. Ryan looked up immediately, as if he had been waiting for something, for me to say something, to react, to fill the space with words that might ease what he was beginning to feel, but I did not offer that. Instead, I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for the meaning to settle, and then I spoke, my voice calm, steady, exactly as it had been at the dinner table, but different now in a way that did not need to be explained. "Your father made sure I would never have to ask for a place in my own home," I said, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly, and I saw the effect of it, not in a dramatic reaction, but in the way Ryan's expression shifted, in the way Vanessa's posture stilled, because the words were not an accusation, they were a statement of fact, one that carried more weight than anything else that could have been said. I did not wait for a response. I did not look for one, because there was nothing they could say that would change what had already been revealed. Instead, I turned slightly, acknowledging Daniel with a small nod, a quiet recognition of the role he had played in bringing clarity to the situation. And then I walked toward the door, my steps measured, unhurried, the same way I had walked out of the house days before. But this time the feeling was entirely different. This was not departure. This was return, not physically, not yet, but in every way that mattered. When I stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me, I felt something settle completely for the first time since. Thomas had been gone. Not relief, not triumph, but balance, the kind that comes when something that was pushed out of place is allowed to return to where it belongs. And as I walked toward the exit, the afternoon light filtering through the windows, I thought briefly of the house, of the quiet rooms, of the chair by the window, of the life that had been built there piece by piece, and I understood that nothing about it had changed, not really, only the way it had been seen, and now that vision had been corrected, not through force, not through conflict, but through something far more lasting, something that did not need to be defended once it was understood. And when I reached my car and opened the door, I paused for just a moment, not to reflect, not to question, but simply to acknowledge the path ahead, because I knew that returning would not require permission, it would not require negotiation, it would only require presence. The same quiet presence I had carried through every moment of this. And as I sat behind the wheel and started the engine, I did not feel like someone who had been cast out and fought her way back. I felt like someone who had simply stepped aside long enough for the truth to catch up, and now that it had, everything else would follow, exactly as it was meant to.